of the programme. But now we can speak to the Conservative MP for Mid-Bedfordshire, Nadine Dorries. She ruffled some feathers this week when she said that pro-European Tories who rebelled on the EU withdrawal bill should be deselected. Thank you for joining us, Ms Dorries. Can we talk first about the transition or implementation period, 2 years after we leave the EU? A number of your colleagues have been expressing some pretty serious concerns about the idea that we will be following all EU rules and regulations during that period. How worried are you about that?
Well, I think everybody's concerned about that. And of course, the important thing is that we get this period, this transition period through and done as quickly as possible. And therefore, we have to reach agreement. And the reason why it needs to be done as quickly as possible is because it's in Britain's interest to do it as quickly as possible. It's in the interest of business, who requires stability and security and some kind of confidence moving forward. And therefore, we do need to get to this position as soon as possible. And, you know, I think the rebels from last week are going to have to explain why. If they don't think we should leave the common fishery policy, why that would not be in Britain's interest. So there's a lot coming up for debate going forward.
But the Chancellor made it pretty clear that we would be replicating the status quo during this transition period. That doesn't mean leaving the CAP or the Common Fisheries Policy or diverging in any way from EU rules.
Well, I don't think the Chancellor did, because I think during his budget speech, he himself talked about the uniqueness of Britain, how we are a unique economy. He talked about my own constituency and my own area, which is going to become a tech corridor. So he's already highlighted areas where we can diverge, which is in high tech. And I think that, you know, if we can do it in that area and we can do it in my constituency, why can't we do it in other areas which affect other constituencies?
I think at that point he was talking about after the transition period, because yesterday he said we would still be subject to all rules and regulations during that period.
Well, it also depends how long that period is going to be. I think most reasonable, sensible people can accept a period of time when we need to have those discussions and when we will abide by those rules. But the problem is, what we don't want to see is Brexit constantly kicked into the long grass as we go further and further forward, and Brexit never seems to be actually happening. There has to be an end game. Everybody wants to see that. And so if we can't see that quickly enough, then we do have to have these unique and these individual situations where we may need to pull out of certain things sooner.
And talking about the endgame, that's what the Cabinet will be discussing this week. And we know there will be a debate inside there, and people like Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, will be arguing that we stay quite closely aligned to the EU rules and regulations even after we have finally left. How worried are you about those so-called soft Brexiteers prevailing in Cabinet?
Gosh, you know, I'm not sure they will prevail. I trust Theresa May, I trust David Davis, I trust Amber Rudd. I trust all of the people in Cabinet to reach an agreement. Because what they will be doing is reaching an agreement that is in Britain's interest, in the interest of Parliament and the interest of Brexit. All of those people in Cabinet stood on a manifesto in 2017 to deliver Brexit, and they have to do that in a way which the British people who democratically exercise their vote would like to see. Otherwise, they will lose the support of the British public.
Now, you say you trust the Cabinet to deliver Brexit. Do you trust all of your Tory MP colleagues to do so?
Well, I hope so. And, you know, can I just say that, you know, I know the rebels are being lauded as some kind of heroes from Wednesday night. Can I tell you who the real heroes are in all of this? They are the Conservative MPs, not the Labour MPs who I think have betrayed their northern constituencies, but it's the Conservative MPs who believed in Remain, who campaigned for Remain during the EU referendum, but who stood on a manifesto to deliver Brexit. And they are the people who are the unsung heroes, who are backing the government and backing Theresa May, and doing so because they know that is their duty to do so. And I think some of the rebels could perhaps learn a lesson from some of their Remain colleagues who know the right thing to do is to deliver Brexit because that was voted for on a democratic mandate.
Now, you're being quite conciliatory. You're not repeating some of the more trenchant criticisms of those rebels who voted against the government this week, but you did at the time tweet that they should be deselected and never allowed to stand as Tory MPs again. Have you changed your mind about that?
Well, gosh, I've definitely changed my mind about it, but what I meant at the time was most of these rebels, They voted for the James Wharton private members bill to have a referendum. They stood on a manifesto in 2015 to deliver that referendum. And then they stood again on a manifesto in 2017 to implement Brexit. I think to go back on those promises that they were elected to honour is something for their associations to discuss and something for them to consider.
But have they gone back on those promises?
To say again,
have they gone back on those promises? I mean,
Sorry.
they would say that they still want to implement Brexit. They just want Parliament to have some control over that rather than the executive.
Well, no, I don't believe they do. I believe what they have deliberately tried to do right from the moment of the referendum result is to frustrate and delay Brexit. And I believe this is a very active tactic that they're using. And no, I don't believe they're honouring the promise that they stood on the 27 manifesto, which is to deliver Brexit. What they should be doing is putting their trust in David Davis and the Prime Minister. And rather than making life difficult for the Prime Minister when she's leaving the following morning to go to Brussels for further negotiations, is to trust the Prime Minister and to assist the Prime Minister. That is what they have been elected to do. There is a Conservative government that has been elected on a manifesto to deliver Brexit. That's what they should be doing. Right from the beginning, they have gone out of their way to delay and frustrate this, and it's something they need to stop doing.
Anna Soubry, who was one of the rebels, writing in the Mail on Sunday today, says that calls for rebels to be deselected and similar calls mean that the Tories now have their own blue momentum movement.
I think most of what Anna Soubry says is quite often nonsense, and I think that is too.
But you presumably agree with Boris Johnson on most matters when it comes to Brexit, and he says that the rebels were honourable people voting with their conscience and that calls for them to be deselected are obscene.
No, he said the death threats were obscene that they've received. And of course, I would expect Boris Johnson to say that. He's the Foreign Secretary and has leadership ambitions. I'd be utterly amazed if he said anything else.
But you don't agree? You don't think he honestly thinks that these are honourable people voting with their conscience?
Yes, I do. I'm sure he does.
And you've frequently voted with your conscience. You've voted against Tory Prime Ministers in the past. You've rebelled against the whip. Why is it different when these people are rebelling against the whip just because they disagree with you?
I voted many times against the government. I am a self-declared rebel, but I do it at a time. You do have to choose your rebellions carefully. What I would say is different now is that we have a Marxist government knocking on the door. We have a full mandate from the British public to deliver Brexit. They voted for it in the referendum. These MPs, they stood on that promise in 2017. Today is very different. You know, what happened on Wednesday night was those rebels, they put a spring in the step of Labour MPs. The party in Jeremy Corbyn's office afterwards could be heard in the car park outside. It's made life a lot more difficult for us to keep that Marxist government out of power eventually. They've helped Labour MPs to find their mojo once again. We didn't want that to happen. We've got a very important job to do. We're in very dangerous times. We're in a situation that's not been seen like this since wartime. They had a responsibility, and that responsibility was to support the government.
All right, Nadine, thank you very much for talking to us this morning. Now we can speak to one of the leading pro-European Conservative MPs, Ken Clarke. He is in Nottingham. Thank you for joining us this morning, Mr Clarke.
I'm glad to be here.
Nadine Dorries there, I hope you could hear her, said that she believes the rebels, you and others who voted against the government on Wednesday, are trying to reverse Brexit.
Oh, you've succeeded in getting her into all this personal stuff, but I don't think she's aiming at me. I was a member of the Heath government, which took us into Europe. I was a member of the Thatcher government, which led Europe into creating the single market. I did not vote for a referendum, and I don't think my constituents were in much doubt about my views. The 2017 manifesto was produced after I'd been adopted as a candidate. No one sent me a copy, and I haven't actually ever seen a copy of it. So let's get back to the big issues, which are how do we preserve the future prosperity of this country? How do we preserve a leading position in world affairs to look after our interest? What is the best thing to do for the interests of our children and our grandchildren? All this other stuff, all this right-wing newspaper rubbish is, as Anna Soubry says, an attempt to get someone to form a Tory equivalent to Momentum.
But do you believe that the way to preserve the things you talk about is to reverse Brexit?
I don't think Parliament can do that, because I was in a small minority when I voted against invoking Article 50, and I'm now accepting that this Parliament is moving towards Brexit. The country is going to leave Brexit. What I want to avoid is our suddenly turning Brexit into a proposal that we start having tariffs between ourselves and the rest of Europe, we start having customs barriers where we have big lorry parks and we train thousands of customs officers. We have different market regulations, different rules about vacuum cleaner noise. That was not what the referendum was about, and more importantly, it will do great damage to our economy. It could cost thousands of jobs and make this country much less attractive for the future investment we need. So that's why the Cabinet, who are deeply divided on the details, have now got to try to reach an agreement that produces a sensible political and economic future for this country in the real world, not in the slightly childish world of knockabout politics.
So how
These
confident
are
are
big issues.
you that the Cabinet will come to that compromise when they start to discuss the end state this week?
Well, we keep having these public statements which are rather alarming, but I'm reasonably confident that they can.
What are you alarmed by in these public statements?
You're trying to get me going on about Boris's habit of occasionally making speeches which are plainly out of line with what the Prime Minister has just done, which he did at the time of the Florence speech, and he's done as last week. But the Chancellor has a duty to actually look after the British economy, to make sure business is not deterred from coming to this country, to make sure we keep our markets in Europe and in the rest of the world as intact as we can. And I think the Cabinet will rally around that.
But Theresa May made pretty clear in her Florence speech that we will leave the single market, we will leave the customs union, there will be no role for the European Court of Justice. Has she not already ruled out the post-Brexit future that you're hoping for?
Well, she first declared that in the Lancaster House speech, which was the first time anybody had interpreted, first time anybody in authority had interpreted the referendum result to mean that, and it does give rise to a lot of problems. What they've now got to address is the problems that arise. As I said, it started with last week. We suddenly faced Ireland, which nobody had mentioned, which is an insult to the people of Northern Ireland and the Republic, really. And we agreed then must keep the border open with regulatory convergence on both sides. It applies to Dover, it applies to Folkestone. We won't get the planning permission for the lorry parks we would need if we rush on and just abandon the single market in March 2019. You've got Gibraltar coming. Let's not go into Gibraltar. That will make the Irish problems look like a picnic. And you'll also have a lot of British businesses, multinational businesses, wondering where on earth Britain is going unless we now interpret the policy. I prefer the policy of the Florence speech. Move on from the Florence speech, which was a big move forward. Move on from the fact that we finally settled these three quite simple issues that had to be settled about our withdrawal. That could have been done months ago had it not been for the troubles inside the Cabinet.
With the vote
and
last
now we need to get on to a sensible economic future worked out by people who are prepared to read the brief and know something about trade, investment and business in the modern globalised economy.
With the vote last week, in which Parliament now gets a meaningful say on the Brexit deal, does that mean, do you interpret that to mean, that Parliament could send the Prime Minister back to Brussels to renegotiate a different deal if Parliament doesn't like it, and therefore your views will have to be taken into account when it comes to the final deal?
The politics in this country is based on all governments having to take the views of Parliament into account. It's very difficult when the Parliament has a small majority, and when there's such confusion because the issue cuts across party lines, it makes it more difficult. But it was a mistake to invoke the royal prerogative and say it's nothing to do with Parliament. It's a mistake to try to avoid parliamentary votes. In the end, as this is determining our future for the next generation or two on very important issues, Parliament will have to approve before government can conclude a deal. That should strengthen Theresa's and David Davis's hand in the negotiations, because just like the other 27 negotiators, they will have to say they can't deliver things which they can't get past their own Parliament.
It's being reported this morning that Heidi Allen, one of the Conservative MPs who rebelled against the government in that vote last week, is facing threats of deselection. How do you... I mean, are you perfectly safe in your constituency, and what do you think about any of the other rebels being deselected?
I don't think any of my constituents have any doubts about my views. Not all my association agree with me, but I've never fallen out personally with anybody about political differences, and I'm certainly not on very friendly terms with my association. I do think this is all nonsense, and I think it's caused by all the rubbish that keeps appearing in the right-wing newspapers, which are completely lost their heads over the whole thing. It is totally absurd to say this is helping Jeremy Corbyn, it's weakening Theresa May and all the rest of it. Here we are, 3 days after the vote took place. Theresa May is no weaker than she was after that. Jeremy Corbyn is not marching towards Downing Street. What has been voted for is a parliamentary accountability of the government. Nothing to do with blocking Brexit, and it is utterly idiotic if a few of our association members in various parts of the country start interpreting this as the start of some sort of purge of backbench members of conscience. Eurosceptics have been voting against the government for the last 30 years, and no one on my side of the argument has ever gone around saying that they should be expelled from the party and sent to outer darkness. The Conservative Party is a broad church. It's a free market party combined with a strong social conscience, and it's been a pro-European party for the first 50 years of my membership.
Ken Clarke, thank you very much for talking to us this